It's a great honor for me to be here at the Empire Club of Canada today, which is arguably the most famous and historically relevant speakers podium to have ever existed in Canada. It has offered its podium to such international luminaries as Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan, Audrey Hepburn, the Dalai Lama, Indira Gandhi, and closer to home, from Pierre Trudeau to Justin Trudeau. Literally generations of our great nation's leaders, alongside with those of the world's top international diplomats, heads of state, and business and thought leaders.
It is a real honor and a distinct privilege to be invited to speak to the Empire Club of Canada, which has been welcoming international diplomats, leaders in business and in science and in politics. And when they stand at that podium, they speak not only to the entire country, but they can speak to the entire world.
Good afternoon, fellow directors, past presidents, members, and guests. Welcome to the 117th season of the Empire Club of Canada. My name is Antoinette Tamilo. I'm the president of the Empire Club and your host for today's virtual event, Women Who Lead, celebrating International Women's Day, featuring Rania Llewellyn in conversation with Jennifer Reynolds. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to recognize our sponsors who generously support the Empire Club and make these events possible. Thank you to our lead sponsor, Canadian Bankers Association, who is also one of our season sponsors. I also want to thank our supporting sponsors, Norton Rose Fulbright, Deloitte, and PwC, and our one other season sponsor, the Waste Connections of Canada. I also want to thank BBC and LiveMeeting.ca, Canada's online event space for webcasting today's event. Now for a few logistical items. First, if you're finding your internet feed is slow, please see below and click the Switch Streams button. And don't hesitate to press the Request for Help button that's available to you if you're experiencing technical difficulties. Our team will be more than happy to assist. I also want to remind everyone on this call that this is an interactive event. Take advantage of the question box to the right of your screen to send in your questions. Rania is looking forward to answering them. It is now my pleasure to call this virtual meeting to order. Welcome to International Women's Day. The theme for this year's International Women's Day is Women Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World. And I can't think of a better person to come speak to that topic than Rania Llewellyn. Rania became the first woman to lead a major bank in Canada when she was appointed as president and CEO of the Laurentian Bank of Canada on October 30th, 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. Born in Kuwait, Rania immigrated to Canada in 1992. She comes to the top job at the Montreal-based Laurentian Bank after a 26-year career at Scotiabank, where she started as a teller before moving up to a series of managerial and executive roles, most recently the Executive Vice President of Global Business Payments. As she progressed through her career, Rania also worked to create opportunities for other immigrants. While at Scotiabank, she launched the Star Right for Newcomers program to provide banking access and support to newcomers in Canada. Rania is a recognized leader and continues to innovate and expand opportunities for women and marginalized people in the financial sector. Rania is also a strategic and innovative leader and has focused her career on improving customer experience, driving growth, and shareholder value. In 2019, Rania received the Women's in Payment Award for Thought Leader from the Women in Payments Association for her outstanding work in modernizing the Canadian payments industry. She was also the recipient of the Top 25 Women of Influence in 2021. And who better to learn about Rania's career than to have Jennifer Reynolds be our moderator today? Jennifer has over 20 years in the financial services industry, which has included senior roles in investment banking, venture capital, and global risk management. In 2017, she was named CEO of Toronto Financial International, Prior to joining TFI, Jennifer was the president and CEO of Women in Capital Markets. She's a director of several boards, as well as co-chair of the UN-convened Financial Centers for Sustainable Finance. Jennifer was named a WXN Top 100 Canada's Most Powerful Women in 2015 and 2017. And congratulations, Jennifer, on being named chair of the board of the World Alliance of International Financial Centers. Great to see Canada get such an important seat on the world stage. I would now like to introduce Neil Parmenter, President and Chief Executive of the Canadian Bankers Association, who will actually kick off this session. Over to you, Neil.
Well, thanks for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the CBA and our member banks, it's a pleasure to introduce our featured guest for today's event, Rania Llewellyn. She's the first woman to head a major Canadian bank. Rania joins Gillian Riley of Tangerine, Linda Seymour, who leads the Canadian operations of London-based HSBC, and Sandra Stewart before her, in challenging the outdated notion that bank CEO is a position reserved for men. International Women's Day is an occasion to recognize the strides women continue to make, as well as an obligation to acknowledge that every sector, including banking, still has more work to do before we can comfortably say that we've achieved equality for all. The good news is that banks across the CBA's membership have built impressive ranks of talented women who are poised to take increasingly visible executive roles in the coming years. Rania's own journey of steady achievement in Canada's banking sector exemplifies this. And now I'll turn things over to Jennifer Reynolds, President and CEO of Toronto Finance International, to host today's conversation.
Thank you, Neil. Rania, I'm so delighted to be here with you to have this discussion, and happy International Women's Day. Welcome.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm really looking forward, and I'm absolutely honored and humbled to be here today.
Well, for me personally, it is an absolute delight to have the first female CEO of a major chartered bank, Canadian chartered bank, here today and chatting with you, and hopefully the first of many to come. I wanted to start it off, though. We all want to talk about your career and how you got into this particular role, but I thought maybe a little icebreaker. Curious, how did it all start? What was that first part-time job you had when you were young?
So, as Antoinette mentioned, I immigrated to Canada in 1992. I was in university at that point, so I landed in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So, to be honest, I graduated with my Bachelor of Commerce from St. Mary's University, majoring in marketing and finance. And I know we're going to get into it probably later, but couldn't find a job. So my first job was serving coffee at Tim Hortons with my BCom from a Canadian university. And so that was my first job. And I have to say, frontline jobs are pretty tough jobs. It was a very humbling experience. I learned tons working at Tim Hortons for almost 8 months.
Well, it's interesting to say that. My first job was a bus girl at Mother's Pizzeria. So I can absolutely relate. Those are tough jobs. It's a good place to start, though. You learn a lot.
Yeah, I used to have nightmares about a double-double, a single-double, a single-triple, and all those massive orders that were coming in all at once. Yes.
Well, I did want to talk, obviously, today about your career here and understand how you got there. And I always find that, there usually is in people's careers sort of 2 or 3 pivotal moments where they made a decision or something happened where you really feel the trajectory changed somehow. So I thought maybe I'd throw that out there and see if, maybe there's a few that come to mind as you think about your career progression.
And you're absolutely right, Jennifer. I think when you're living in the moment, you don't look at them as pivotal moments. It's only when you kind of take a step back and look back to say, how did I get here? How did this all happen? And so I would say there's a number of them. I would say the first one was early in my career. I had been at the bank for 3 years. And anyway, I was working for an individual. It wasn't really working out. And I actually got 90 days notice in Halifax to basically find another job. And so that was a pivotal moment because I decided to leave Halifax, Nova Scotia, and come to Toronto. And that really kind of set me on a very different path in terms of opportunities that were presented from a scale perspective. And so that was a pivotal moment. The other one was I actually was seconded to work on a strategic project for a period of 8 months after having 2 kids, coming back after a second mat leave. And I didn't realize I was creating my own job. And so, and it was leaving, I was a corporate banker at that time. I'd been a commercial banker before. So the first, 10 years of my career, all I did was transactions. And so moving into a role that was a leadership role, it was a startup business. So it was VP of multicultural. That was pivotal because it was retail. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. And I have to say the first 6 months, I was stretched like there was no other, like I was so stretched. It was pretty stressful, but that's how you grow. And so I would say that was definitely a pivotal moment. And I loved and I learned tons about leadership and the importance of strategy and communication in that role. And then the other one was when I was starting to think about my next move, I really wanted to go back into transactions. And I moved in as the SVP. I was the head of the distribution network for Roynat Capital. And within 18 months, I became president and CEO. And so that was really my first foray into leading a national sales force. But it was also a subsidiary that nobody really knew anything about. It was kind of just outside of the banking sector to a certain degree. It was creative financing. I used to call it the sexy financing. And so that really put me on a very different trajectory. And what I tell people is, as you move around in different roles, you pick up on different things. And so different skills, you learn in terms of leading different types of people, whether I got to see how hard people in finance work, technology. It was my first president CEO role. And so you change as a leader. I used to always say, had I moved straight from transactions to that role, I would have just been a transaction junkie. I would have been a deal junkie. So I think it's really, really important to move around. So I would say those were critical roles. And obviously the most pivotal one is the one that I just did 4 months ago.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, though. I think getting that diversity of experience is great. And it's risky, though. At times you can be jumping into things and not know where it's going to go.
Yes.
One question that is always out there is, do women aspire to be CEOs just as much as men? So I wanted to ask you, did you always want to get into that CEO chair? Was that something you thought about? And what were the challenges, I guess, in getting there?
Well, here's the thing, Jennifer. I didn't even want to be a banker. I initially wanted to be a doctor, then I ended up in banking somehow. And my dad was like, banks are good, stable companies for you to work at. So I wouldn't necessarily say I aspired for a specific role, but I always aspired to be challenged. And so I would say every 3 to 4 years, it was one of those things where it was like, okay, been there, done that. I'd like to do something bigger, something different. And so it's like, I look at it as your lifespan on this earth is building your resume. And so it's a journey that you take. And so what are some of the experiences that you want to have along the way? And what are the new skills and tools that you're adding to your toolkit? And so I wouldn't have said I aspired for that role, but I was always aspiring for bigger challenges throughout my career.
So when you look back, are there any sort of, the big challenge, the hurdles that you had to get over to get into a role like this?
So what I would say is, I'm sure a lot of people out there in the audience would, or that are listening in would say, I mean, there's lots of challenges along the way. I said early on in my career, I had 90 days notice. So that was a pivotal thing in terms of, I didn't understand what was going on. And that's when I realized the importance of cultural fit and being self-aware of what's the environment that would be best suited to kind of, that I can actually work and aspire and just bring my whole self into work. And so I found that, for example, working in the corporate banking, investment banking space actually suited my personality. And as you can see, I don't have an accent. I can probably come from any country in the world, but people very quickly forgot that I actually grew up in a very different country, in a very different culture. So the diversity of thinking, the cultural differences, I found that was really hard early on. I was told I was too outspoken, too aggressive, too out of the box thinker, too this, too that. And so I do tell people early on in your career, it's really important to be self-aware, and then find a cultural fit and environment that will actually embrace you, right? As you move up in the organization, then you can kind of create and set that culture from the top to the bottom, right? So I would say those were challenges. And then obviously there were challenges across the way in terms of, I still remember the first boss I worked for. After I was trained for around 11 months, I remember there was a vacant job. I was ready to go for it. I was trained. And he said, I'm looking for a man and I'm looking for someone who is older. And this was going to be my new boss, right? So I would say there's lots of those little stories along the way. But you know what? You just shrug it off, you brush it off, and you just move on. And yeah.
Yeah, you do. You just have to drive on in those situations. I wanted to switch gears a little bit, but before I do, I just wanted to mention to the audience that we absolutely would love to take some of your questions too. Rania and I are going to chit chat, but I'm happy to integrate in any questions that the audience has too. So here we are, you take on this role, middle of a pandemic, challenging times to say the least. What's your outlook right now, you know, for the industry, for Laurentian in particular? What are you seeing in the next sort of couple of years?
Yeah, so I was kind of joking. I was like, maybe I'm having a midlife crisis during this whole COVID thing in terms of taking a role in an institution where I didn't know a single soul and couldn't even visit any of our physical offices or anything along those lines. So yeah, I think you had mentioned the importance, Jennifer, of taking risks. And I think, you know, this was a calculated risk. It was one of those things where it was like, when is this opportunity going to happen? Here's an opportunity for me to come in and really build the bank that I've always dreamed of working for, right? So I think it's a huge opportunity there. In terms of our industry is changing at a massive, pace. I was head of payments before taking this job, and payments was really central to everything that was happening during COVID in terms of supporting consumers and businesses getting payments into their hands, whether it was all of the, the government programs and delivering all of that. The digital adoption by which all people had to kind of, very quickly pivot to. And so that's really changed consumer behavior. And they tell you that, if it was only a couple of months, consumer behavior would have reverted back, but consumer behavior is going to actually stay. And so, people are talking about, cash in circulation, digital currency. So I think the way we interact and our expectations of banks are going to be very different, which is why the advice culture is going to be critical to the future success of organizations. Digital is absolutely a critical component from a strategic perspective, but humans also want, that special touch, that personalized touch. So I think that's one thing that we've all missed during COVID as well. And so servicing is going to be critical. Remote work environments, I think it's proven to everybody. I remember talking to some of my investment banking colleagues who would have never, ever dreamed of working from home. And they're loving working from home, right? And so it's one of those things that I think there's a lot of key lessons learned and silver linings that are coming out of the pandemic in terms of how are we going to lead differently as well. Leadership skills are very, very different in a COVID type environment. So I think there's lots of key learnings. And I think it's impacted all industries, not just the banking industry. So it's exciting times for everybody in terms of figuring out what does it look like going forward.
So you mentioned leadership, and that's actually, I think, a really interesting topic right now, because I think all of us in management roles are trying to figure this out all of a sudden. How do you lead in these strange times? And I think it fundamentally has changed the way we view our employees in many ways and strategies for managing people. So I thought maybe any learnings from you on that front as you've gone through this process, anything you'll take away from a change in style in terms of management?
Yeah, so one thing to be honest, I benefited from myself and my leadership team, we did a few years ago, was really pivot to Agile. And with Agile, you have those daily stand-up huddles and daily touch bases, which a lot of people, if they've never done that before, it was more ad hoc. So you go into the office, you talk to the people that you see. So I think one of the things the pandemic has really taught us is the importance of deliberate communication. And so making the effort to make sure you connect with everybody and not just those that are in your sphere or those that are coming into your office or that you see on the floor. So I think the importance of communication has definitely been heightened in terms of the quality of communication and the frequency of communication. I think the other thing too is empathetic leadership has really come to the forefront. So, spending the time at the very beginning of the calls to say, how are you doing? How are you managing through this? Because it's hit people very, very differently. So I think, empathy and caring and leadership is absolutely critical. So those don't necessarily come natural to everybody, right? And so I think those are skills that people have had to develop. And I think they're going to have to stay here for a long, long time. The other thing too is, I actually think there's a lot of great benefits to reaching a broader group of people in a much shorter period of time. So since I've joined Laurentian, I've been able to meet, let's say, around 300 or 400 staff that I would have had to get on a plane and travel. But I was able to do that in the first couple of months of being on the job, because you can have virtual meetings. I can have them back to back, round tables, even using simultaneous translation, where, I can speak in my preferred language, and my employees can actually listen to them in their preferred language. So I do think there's a lot of great leadership skills that we've all learned from that. The other thing too, I think that the pandemic has shown is that, if everyone comes together and we all have one purpose to solve for, how quickly we can actually deliver on something. And so it's one of those key learnings that you say, prioritizing is such a hard thing for people to do. But the pandemic has proven that if we all have one thing that we're all working on, we all band together, the silos are all broken down, we can move faster, we can be more nimble and more agile. So how can you take that back when things start coming back to normal, so that you can continue to deliver value to your shareholders, your consumers, and to your employees? So I think there's a lot of great learnings there. And I think the remote, working from home remotely is here to stay. And so how do you make sure that as a leader, you're making a level playing field for people, whether they're at home or in the office? And I think that's going to be an important nut to crack for everybody as a leader, to ensure that, we're assessing our talent appropriately and we're creating a very inclusive environment for people to work.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I was having a conversation about this change. If we are going to be working from home, it changes management, obviously, as we were talking about, but also performance evaluation, right? And I think that's something that we're catching up with a little bit. But, I do agree with you on the pace of change. I think we've proven in the financial services industry that we can move very quickly. And I think that's a good thing. We were forced to take risks, of course, that we probably wouldn't have otherwise. But I think we've shown the amazing things that we can actually do on that front. So I did have a question from the audience, and it goes back to a point you made earlier, and I think it's a good one. The audience member was mentioning that they actually have a very strong personality. That's been sort of remarked upon. And so the question was really around, how do you balance that? How do you bring that to work in a way that's appropriate, allows you to be authentic and be yourself, but still, you've got a strong personality. That's who you are.
Yeah, so I think what tends to happen is, I think we should take feedback as a blessing. So if you're receiving that feedback constantly from different number of colleagues versus one or two, then there's obviously something that you need to do differently from a perception perspective. So you need to just kind of figure out, do I need to tone it down? And that's one thing I've learned over time is, I'm not going to win. I don't have to win every single battle or fight. I don't need to be engaged in every single conversation. And it depends on the peer group or the audience that I'm sitting with. And so I've learned, when do you tone it back? When do you kind of beef it up? So when can I be just me without having to overthink things? And I think that's really important. It's like doing a presentation. Who's your audience? What's of interest to them? So how do you customize your communication style depending on who you're with? So I think that's a very important leadership skill to have. And so I learned that the hard way, because it was one of those things where it's just me and I'm just going to be me. But ultimately, if you want to get people to hear your point of view, you need to be able to adapt your style appropriately. And so I think making sure you get feedback from a variety of people and figuring out how to rebalance that, it's really important. I have to say, in my leadership team, I usually tell them, listen, I come across as probably overly opinionated, overly passionate. So then you think that I'm not open to other suggestions potentially. And so I say that up front, but no, I want you to challenge me. I welcome you to challenge me with new ideas, right? So I do that now, knowing how I sometimes could come across, to ensure that I'm empowering everybody to engage and inviting everybody to engage in that conversation. So that's another tool that you can use depending on who the audience is.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You always have to be aware of the audience and how everyone receives information or style in a different way, and being aware of that, I think, is a really important piece of it. We talked in the introduction, it was brought up, and you mentioned it, that you immigrated here to Canada in 1992. And, we pride ourselves on diversity in Canada and on being a welcoming place for immigrants. So I wanted to talk a bit about that and how that experience was for you, and, was where were the opportunities or challenges specific to that part of, what you bring to the table?
Yeah. So what I tell people is really diversity is a statistic, right? So versus inclusion is something that you actually action and you're intentional about it. So like I said, my first job in Canada with my degree from a Canadian university was working at Tim Hortons. And so I couldn't even get an interview, Jennifer, because my name was not Llewellyn. My last name was not Llewellyn. It was very Middle Eastern. And no one would even call me for an interview. And so I think one of the things that was really frustrating was, as I said, I didn't have an accent, but on paper, so inclusive hiring, making sure that your process is an inclusively hiring process is really, really important because, we all have our biases, right? So I couldn't get a job.
I think I actually got really caught up with what you were saying, so I don't want to miss that point. I think we dropped off, if I'm correct, for others, just after you were talking about the difficulty in getting a job and the fact that your last name was different and that impact.
Yeah, so I didn't appreciate how, that could be a potential barrier in terms of just actually getting that first interview, right? So that was kind of the first hurdle. And then when you get into the working environment, every culture is very, very different, right? And so understanding the cultural nuances and going back to understanding your audience, I grew up in a very Middle Eastern environment where we tend to be quite direct. We're quite assertive, right? And so if you came to my house, Jennifer, my mom would ask you, where do you live? How much does your cost house? What is your house? Like, it's just like a million and one, and that's just natural. That's just culturally acceptable, right? And so not understanding those cultural nuances were a challenge to me at the very beginning as well, because I couldn't understand why I was coming across as, being a little too forceful or being a little, right? So I would say that that's really, really important, is to understand your environment. I would say those were early on. And then when I met my husband and he said, I really want you to take my last name. To be honest, I didn't even think twice about it. My dad was quite upset. And so I actually kept my last name as my middle name. But you know what, Jennifer? Nobody ever asks me about where I'm from anymore, right? And it's very interesting because my first name, Rania, the Queen of Jordan, I'm half Jordanian, is Queen Rania, right? And my husband also taught me, he said, because my name is unique, when I introduce myself, I always say Rania, like Tanya. And all of a sudden, people are like, I know how to pronounce your name.
Jennifer, it's always when you ask those very pointed questions that it disappears. I'm sitting at the edge of my seat waiting for her to finish, and it goes wire like crazy. Rania, you're back. Okay, over to you, ladies.
The challenges of being remote.
I know, it's our new world. But I'm going to switch topics. I obviously it's International Women's Day. I always, at this point, reflect on where are we at, how far have we come. I'm a very impatient person on this front, I got to tell you, but I wanted to get your perspectives. How do you think we're doing in corporate Canada in the financial services sector on getting more women and more diversity in leadership? And how do you think we stack up globally?
Yeah, so I would say, Jennifer, I think I'm an impatient person as well. I know a lot of people would say we've come a long way. I still think we have a long way to go, and I don't think it's moving as quickly as it should. I'm very proud at Laurentian that we choose to challenge by leading the way. We were the first institution to actually have the first female chair of a board of a Canadian bank in 1997. And now they've appointed me as the first women CEO in 2020. But I do think we've done well on the diversity front. It's on the inclusion front. And to be honest, it's not just in the corporate world. I think it's systemic throughout our I think our culture as well. I have a daughter, and I have to say, it starts very early on in terms of some of these systemic biases in the system. And words matter, and how people behave and how we model is absolutely important. And I think we just need more role models at the top of the house so that people can start believing that it can happen. But I'm a big believer in targets. I think that we need to set targets, just like any financial targets. That's one thing I introduced at Laurentian. All of my leaders have targets on their scorecards in terms of diversity targets, but more importantly, I've actually included it in our financial package that goes to the board. So, just like we measure numbers, why aren't we measuring it as part of our financial metrics as well? And then holding people accountable. So I think we still have a long ways to go. But it's good to see progress, but I think we should force it to move a little faster. That's my personal opinion, Jennifer.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We've been talking about it for a long time. We need to see those numbers move. And one of the things that we often hear is that it's the children, it's the babies, and that's the fundamental barrier that's holding us back. I wanted to get your perspectives on that. Is that what you think is the big barrier out there that's holding us back, or are there other things that you think are factoring in here that are just as or more important even than that?
I do think there is some truth to that, Jennifer. I think ultimately, when you do get married, it becomes a very personal decision, and it depends on your personal situation, right? So my husband is very happy to take a seat back and be my biggest fan and my biggest cheerleader. So that was a personal choice that we did. I do think that from an infrastructure perspective, childcare is really important. And so if we have a better childcare system that supports women going forward, that would definitely benefit. As employers, I think the flexible work arrangements that the pandemic has presented can create tons of opportunities for women as well. And then as leaders, we need to make sure that the leaders are on board and stop saying we're going to take a chance on a woman. Just give them the job, right? Like, men are promoted based on potential. And it's like, for women, it's like, let's just test you one more time. There's one more thing I need you to work on. One more thing, right? So it's one of those things where let's just take a leap and get on with it. So I do think there is some truth to that, but that becomes a very personal decision. And you do need an infrastructure to be able to help you with that. Like, I was very fortunate. I had my family who helped out with the kids. But like I said, that was a personal choice. But I do think, I think that's a cop-out to a certain extent.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, there's other issues out there that are holding us back that are far more important. And I think ultimately, we have to enable men to take on some of those responsibilities too, and make that okay in the workplace. So I think that's another element to it as well. One question, I got to ask it because you always get asked this when you're a woman on a panel or being interviewed for anything, the work-life balance question. So what's your secret to success on that front?
Yeah, I'm not sure I believe in the concept of work-life balance, Jennifer. I think, if I recall, you have 6 kids as well. So I'd love to hear how you manage 6 kids. I only have 2. So what I would say is, one thing I've learned early on is, a lot of times we're really hard on ourselves, particularly if you're a type A personality, in terms of, I want to be an awesome wife, an awesome daughter, an awesome mother, an awesome sister. And you can't do it always at the same level every single day. And so if you kind of grade yourself in terms of, today I'm going to be an A employee, I'm going to be a B mother and a C daughter. That's okay. Tomorrow that whole formula changes all over again. And I learned that lesson, and I'll never forget it. It was one night where I overcommitted to be all those things all in one night. I went to my daughter's concert. I was sitting outside trying to recruit a new employee to my department. And the whole time I was thinking, I got to go in and watch that concert. I went into the concert, and while I was watching the concert, I'm thinking of the next event that I needed to go to. And so I have to say, I did all 3 things terribly poorly. And so that was when I made a decision where it was like, I try not to go out more than 2 nights a week for client events or anything to do with work. And so I think it's really, really important to kind of self-reflect in terms of what's important to you and how do you kind of balance things out and stop worrying about what everybody else is doing. And I think, you experience that for the first time, particularly when you're a new mom, in terms of, how everyone's child is more perfect than your child and what you're doing wrong. And I think we do that, whether it's at work or at home, and we need to stop doing that. We need to give ourselves a break.
I couldn't agree more. I don't believe in work-life balance, to be honest. I think there's just an ebb and flow. It's, I've always considered it, when I'm at work, I'm still a mother, and when I'm at home, I'm still a CEO. So they don't really get pulled apart, in this perfect manner every day. And it's not pretty some days, but it all works somehow. I wanted to talk a little bit about the pandemic, of course, and just, there's been all kinds of talk around the She Session and, a lot of concern around the impact on women. And some of that is because of what industries they work in that are harder hit and jobs haven't come back. But we're also seeing the more disturbing trend of women leaving the workforce. And we know family, of course, is weighing heavily on that. So just wanted to get your perspectives on, what do you think we should be doing as an industry or just generally to combat that? Because we certainly don't want to slide back. So how are we going to make sure that we keep women in the workforce, keep women in our businesses, and try and abate some of the issues that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, so I know there's a number of projects like the Prosperity Project. There's a lot of research that's being done now. And as you said, Jennifer, I think it really depends on where you are and what industries you're in. And I think, some of those industries that were really, hard hit in particular, a lot of women worked in those industries. So I think upskilling, I think as corporate Canada, we should be doing, we should be investing in upskilling, creating new skill sets for our people. I do think flexible work arrangements and not just in terms of where they work from, but also being flexible about the hours of operation, right? I think that's one of the things that people, now that we're all working from home, it's you could be working 24/7, like you're plugged into 3 or 4 different screens all at the same time. So I think it's really important to give employees some flexibility in terms of when they work and how they work. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And then I do think in terms of the childcare support that is needed, because I can't even imagine being, stuck at home with 2 young kids where they're being homeschooled and you have a full-time job. So I can see how that would have a massive impact. And like you said, the women tend to have the brunt of the housework. And so and the rearing of the kids. So there's definitely something that needs to give somewhere. But I'd love to hear from your perspective in terms of how, if you have any other ideas in terms of how we solve for that.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of them. I think we just need to be really diligent as businesses if we're losing women to make sure we're trying to pull them back. And if they're taking a break, pull them back in. There's all kinds of successful returnships out there. I think maybe the pandemic will force us to do a little more of that. But I think the upskilling piece is a really important one too, because we need to see women in across sectors, which we're not seeing. And there's actually a question that came in from the audience, which I thought was very interesting. It was around, how technology is changing the jobs within the financial services industry. Of course, we all need, different skills, different digital skills, these types of things. And the question is around, is that a danger to women? Do we see that, are some women going to be losing their jobs if they're not in those technical areas and in other parts? Any thoughts around that, around what are the challenges of technology and this evolution that's how it's impacting our workforce?
I think that goes to upskilling and just learning new skill sets, Jennifer. I would say that'll impact everybody. It's not just women. That's a new thing that's here to stay. I think business people need to understand technology. Like over the past 5 years, I actually ran a technology team in payments. And so I didn't know anything about technology 5 years ago. And so, and now that I do, I appreciate the importance of understanding how technology can actually enable business. And I think people that are in technology need to understand, how technology interfaces with business and generates business. Because I don't believe there are technology projects, right, or programs. They're actually all business driven, right? So it's upskilling, it's learning more. And I think that organizations can do that by making sure that there are programs, there are courses that everyone can go and learn, whether it's around AI or machine learning, because it's going to impact all of our businesses in one way, shape, or form. So I think it's really important. And just going back to that previous comment, Jennifer, I think one of the key things I talked about was we included targets, but not only targets, I'm big on retention targets, right? So we should constantly be recruiting our top talent, because if you're not doing it, somebody else is. And so I think it's absolutely critical, particularly during those difficult times, is to stay in touch with your employees, understand what challenges they have, and make sure that you're providing them with that environment and ensuring that you can retain them. And so being flexible is absolutely going to be critical to maintaining women in the workforce.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That retention piece, I mean, that's the difficult one to my mind. I think the recruiting part is the easier one. It's retention, because that, again, it goes to inclusion, of course, right? And are we really creating that inclusive environment?
And giving women opportunities to, get mentored by other men. We need men as part of this whole process, right? Are they allies? Are we getting these meaty projects that are going to actually give us visibility to the board of directors or to some senior leaders, executives, and so on? So I think it's absolutely critical to give, that opportunities to women as well, because that'll be part of the retention, but more importantly, part of the development as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And those ones, unfortunately, don't tend to develop as organically as they do for men. Those types of sponsorship, where you're getting those opportunities, where someone takes a risk on you, those types of things. So if you were to go back and you could give some great advice to your younger self, what would that advice be?
Probably take a deep breath and not try to don't take everything so personally, I would say. And learn how to bite your tongue. You don't have to actually, win every single argument in every single discussion. I would say those would be the two. And be a little bit more patient. I have to say, I know you mentioned you're impatient, and I'm quite impatient. I have become a lot more patient, though. I think being a parent does that to you to a certain extent, and not being a perfectionist in absolutely everything. It's okay if you make mistakes. So I would say those are some of the key things I would tell my younger self.
If there's a question from the audience around young women at Laurentian and sort of, is there, what's the legacy you'd love to leave behind, I guess, or the inspiration for those young women at Laurentian?
Yeah, so I've been there 4 months, and I would say the employees at Laurentian have probably started seeing, I'm very dedicated to equality and diversity and inclusion. And so what we started doing is every single month there's something that, communication that goes out. We started, so it was the first time we were celebrating the Black Employee History Month in February, and we started a Courageous Conversation series. And I'm going to use that as an umbrella to have different conversations. So one about our Black employees and just education around that, about women. Then we can talk about LGBTQ and a bunch of other things. So I think starting with educating people and having those courageous conversations, getting out of our comfort zone and taking a moment to understand. I tell men, I'll never know what it's like to be a man, just like you'll never know what it's like to be a woman. But let's have an open and honest conversation as to how, these choice of words or how this comes across, right? How I'm hearing it. It's like you said, how you receive information is very, very different. And as humans, we're all very complex, right? So you're complex based on your socioeconomic background, your education, your upbringing. So it's not just gender, right? That formulates how we think. So diversity, it comes in so many different packages. So I think it's really, really important to give our employees a voice so that we can actually create that inclusive environment. And so I'm super proud of what we're doing. Particularly, and I'm super excited about the Courageous Conversation series. And right now at Laurentian, we have around 55% of our staff that are actually female, and over 40% of our directors and above are actually female as well. And so I'm hoping that we'll get to some form of equality in short order.
That's fantastic. I'm glad to hear those stats. And I think you raise an interesting point around. I think when I was younger, I struggled with bringing sort of the real Jennifer to work. I think I brought some version of her, and it wasn't until I actually brought the real person there that I actually think I started to do much better. But we have to create that environment and encourage people to do exactly that. When you're not the dominant person in the room, it's a lot harder. You need to be encouraged on that front. That's for sure.
Yeah, what I tell people is why fit in when you can stand out? It's an opportunity to do that. Yes, for sure.
That's a great point. I say that to my kids. They're teenagers though, so they never want to stand out. They always want to be like everybody else.
Well, I don't know about your teenager. My teenagers don't want to hear anything I have to say anyway. So
maybe in their 20s, we'll find out. So so there's a few questions coming in right now around financial literacy and just, wealth and women. There was an article recently about how women are retiring, with much less than men, and we live longer. And, clearly this is something that's got to be addressed. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what should we be doing what can we be doing better around financial literacy? Is it when we're younger women? Is it, how do we reach women now so that there is this massive transfer of wealth that's taking place?
Yeah.
So we actually need women to be comfortable and educated in this area.
Yeah, I think it needs to start early on in school, to be honest, financial literacy in terms of, it's got to be part of our regular curriculum. I think that's an important lesson in life to learn early on. And then I do think, obviously, as banks, we're responsible. We should be doing a lot more financial literacy, whether it's on the wealth side of things or whether it's in the consumer space. So I do think there's definitely more work for us to do there in terms of, and then creating a little bit of a platform, particularly for women as well, right? In certain, and it has to also be culturally sensitive, because in certain cultures, people don't talk about money. In certain homes, families, people don't talk about money. I know in our household, my husband and I are both bankers, and so our kids grew up around it. So they know what a credit card is, they know what debt is, and so on. But a lot of people don't have those discussions. So I think we gotta attack it in so many different ways, whether it's in schools, at homes, and obviously through the banking system and through the financial sector as well. But I do think there's an opportunity for all of us to do a better job on that front.
Brings up one of my questions always is, if you think about wealth, for instance, or you think about capital markets, these are areas where financial services just struggle to get better gender equality. And so, I spent a lot of time at Women in Capital Markets, my role prior to this, trying to attract women to the industry. What do you try to do to make it be appealing and to attract young women, to make them understand these are great opportunities, great careers for women?
Yeah. So our paths didn't really cross, Jennifer, because when I took over the diversity inclusion file in the global banking and markets, that was just a year ago, and we launched a new program called Elevate, and it was really just that. Let's identify. Data and analytics are really important just to understand. I'm big on pipelines, and let's look at the data. And so we're good, like you said, on the recruitment side, and then something happens and we can't retain them, right? And it's always around the associate director level. That's what tends to happen. And so, making sure you have the tension and the targets at every single level and you're having those conversations is really, really important. And understanding, why are they leaving? And sometimes I think, they think that, I'm going to have to put more hours if I get promoted, and I'm going to have to do this, and I'm going to have to give up that. And so I think having more open conversations in terms of what it actually means to become a leader in an organization and how others can balance it out, because I think role modeling then becomes extremely important. So let's have an open conversation as to, how are you able to do it? How can someone else do it as well? And I know the situations are different. So some of the instances I'd heard is, they're investment bankers, they go and have a child, and you know what? FaceTime is important on the floor. So, hey, if you've left at 5 o'clock to go pick up your child from daycare, right? You're kind of, you get like a back tick next to your name. When that person, by the time they put their child to bed, they're back online and they're getting their work done. And so I think we need to pivot the way we're thinking in terms of, it's not how many hours you need to put in the office, but it's what are you actually producing? And so I think sometimes we check out as well. So I think women need to kind of stay in and have those conversations as part of the education. I think we've become so politically correct now that I think that a lot of the men are uncomfortable having those conversations because they're worried they're going to say the wrong thing. And then women are not feeling confident enough to have that conversation to say, let me walk you through how this feels. So I think we need to come to an agreement. It starts with education, and let's have open and honest and transparent conversations. Because I don't think anyone that goes into an investment banking or corporate banking career or capital markets career doesn't see it, like they all aspire to be top performers, right? And they're all A personalities. So, but I'd love to hear from your research when you were in women in capital markets, like what happens?
Well, it's interesting. We did do a study around this. And so women and men come into the industry equally engaged and equally, to your point, aspiring to do well. Unfortunately, though, you see after 2 or 3 years, what happened was you saw women become less engaged and less positive about their outlook in the career, and men the exact opposite, became more engaged and more positive about their career. So what is happening? And that was before they were having children. So you couldn't just point the finger and say, oh, well, they're thinking about having kids, and so they're thinking about leaving the industry. They were early on in their career at this point. So there's clearly was something else going on there. So I think it is about that inclusiveness, right? And the environment. And it's a bit of chicken and egg, there's no doubt, because if we can't get more women in there and into leadership roles and sitting in chairs like yours, then we don't understand that there is a different way to lead, and there could be a different model that could be emerging. But I mean, I do hope that to your earlier points around how we're changing as an industry, that hopefully, we do bring some of these good things with us, that flexibility, that empathetic leadership forward. So that's hopefully the silver lining we see here. We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted one last question for you to throw out there. If you wanted to leave just young women out there with some advice on, in their careers and just aspiring to leadership, what would those few pieces of advice be for them?
I would say my single piece of advice is get out of your comfort zone, and not just get out, like just leap out of your comfort zone and take some big risks, because until you take those big risks, we don't grow as humans. Like, you really need to get stretched and really figure out, yes, I'm capable of doing that, right? So, and no one's going to do that for you. You have to actually take charge of your own career and take those big leaps of faith, believe in yourself, and make sure, listen, if you have a seat at the table, make sure you have a voice at the table as well.
I couldn't agree with you more. Those are great words of advice. Rania, it's been great chatting with you. And I'm sure people would want to continue the discussion. So I'm sad to be closing things off, but I'm going to turn it over now to Antoinette for some closing comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you both. And I'm even sadder because I could have sat here and listened to the both of you for another hour. And I'm sure a lot of our audience feels the same way. So many parallels. Like, this is not just a discussion about the finance industry. I come from a real estate industry background, and so many parallels there. When I think about, fitting in versus standing out, love that. Love the concept of your lifespan on earth, where are you at? And lucky Laurentian Bank for you having a midlife crisis and taking the risk. I think they're very fortunate. And I think from an industry perspective, I think your leadership will have an impact on other banks as well, and hopefully other industries. Your concept about not trying to be perfect at everything and having that report card really resonated with me as a woman, as somebody who's had a career in real estate, as a mother, as a wife, with a husband who decided to stay at home at one point in our career because we thought that was the right thing for us to do. Really resonated with me, because we always try to be A in everything. Well, that's impossible. So that was a really big takeaway for me, and I'm sure many in our audience as well. And you're so right about needing more role models at the top. And I can't think of a better role model. I didn't know you, Rania, and Jennifer had heard a lot about you, and have to say that you both are terrific role models for a lot of women. And that conversation around, yes, it's different, and need to make sure that there's inclusion, and that constant discussion is so important. And, I like your comment, Rania, about you're not a man. So hear my perspective and understand the other's perspective as well. Having those open conversations is so important. And I think that often women tend to not use their voice, so that, comment about fit in, but make sure you stand out and use your voice, I think is such a strong message for everybody to take away today. So I want to thank you both for taking the time to be with us today to have this really important discussion. I hope we had more time to continue the discussion. I just want to let everybody know that, we have many events planned that we're working on, and, make sure you check on our site, empireclubofcanada.com, to look at our upcoming events. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and in particular, our sponsors, and Rania and Jennifer for having this terrific, very open and honest discussion and sharing your stories with us. That really makes it even more special. So thanks again, and this meeting is now adjourned.